The gunshot that killed her husband echoed in Julia Emmett's mind every night, but she never expected the mountain man with ice-blue eyes to hear it too when he looked at her across the general store that autumn morning in 1872. She was examining a bolt of dark fabric, her black mourning dress already wearing thin at the elbows after 8 months of widowhood, when she felt someone watching. Julia glanced up to find a tall, broad-shouldered man with shoulder-length dark hair and a thick beard staring at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Not desire, not pity, but recognition, as though he saw something in her face that mirrored whatever lived behind his own guarded eyes. "Madam," he said, tipping his worn hat. His voice was rough, like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. Julia nodded stiffly and turned back to the fabric, her heart hammering. She had grown accustomed to the pitying glances from the women of Taylorsville, Utah, and the opportunistic interest from men who thought a widow might be desperate enough to overlook their flaws. But this man's gaze held something different, something that felt dangerously like understanding. "That will be $4 even, Mrs. Emmett," the shopkeeper said, wrapping her purchases in brown paper. She counted out the coins carefully, aware that each one spent brought her closer to destitution. Thomas had left her nothing but debts and a small cabin on the edge of town. She had been taking in mending and laundry, but it was barely enough to keep food on her table. The mountain man was still there when she turned to leave, now purchasing supplies: coffee, beans, salt pork, ammunition. The kinds of things a man bought when he lived far from civilization. Julia hurried out into the crisp October air, pulling her thin shawl tighter. The aspens on the mountains surrounding Taylorsville had turned golden, and the first real cold of autumn was settling into the valley. She needed to find more work before winter, needed to stockpile firewood, needed to do 100 things that felt impossible when simply getting through each day took all her strength. "Madam, wait." She turned to find the mountain man following her, his arms full of supplies. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his hands gripped his parcels as though he expected them to be snatched away at any moment. "I am sorry, but I do not know you, sir," Julia said, keeping her voice level despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Name's Kieran Nolan," he said. "I have a cabin up in the mountains about 10 miles north of here. Come down for supplies every few weeks." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I could not help but notice you counting your coins in there, looking like everyone hurt to part with." Heat rushed to Julia's cheeks. "My finances are not your concern, Mr. Nolan." "No, they are not," he agreed. "But I have hides that need tanning, and my winter coat needs mending. I am better at tracking elk than sewing, and I would pay fair wages for the work." Julia studied him, trying to discern his true intentions. He did not look away from her scrutiny, just stood there with his supplies and his offer hanging between them. "Why me?" she finally asked. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Pain, she thought, deep and old and never quite healed. "Because you look like someone who understands that some days, just breathing takes more courage than most people will ever need," he said quietly. "And because I think you would rather work for your money than accept charity, same as me." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Julia blinked back sudden tears, horrified at her reaction. She had not cried since the funeral, had locked everything down so tightly that sometimes she wondered if she would ever feel anything again besides this hollow numbness. "I charge 15 cents an hour for mending," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I would need to see the hides to give you a fair price for tanning." Kieran's face did not exactly smile, but something in his eyes softened. "I will bring them to you tomorrow, Where is your place?" "The small cabin at the end of Willow Street, near the creek." He nodded once, then tipped his hat again and walked away toward a sturdy paint horse tied outside the saloon. Julia watched him load his supplies into his saddlebags with efficient movements, mount up, and ride north out of town without looking back. She stood there longer than she should have, her own packages growing heavy in her arms, wondering what had just happened, and why she felt more alive than she had in months. That night, Julia lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the loose board on the north side of the cabin that she could not afford to fix. She thought about Kieran Nolan's eyes, about the way he had seen through her carefully maintained composure to the brokenness beneath. It should have made her angry, that invasion of her privacy. Instead, it made her feel less alone. She had loved Thomas once, or thought she had. They had married when she was 19 and he was 23, both of them young and optimistic about their future together. But Thomas had been a dreamer with no practical sense, always chasing the next scheme that would make them rich. He had invested in a silver mine that never produced silver, bought cattle that died in a harsh winter, gambled away money they did not have. The night he died, he had been in a poker game he could not afford to lose. When he was caught cheating, the other player drew faster. Thomas had been dead before he hit the saloon floor, and Julia had been left with nothing but his debts and the whispers of the town. She did not miss him. That was the truth she could barely admit to herself. She missed the idea of him, the man she had thought he would become. But the real Thomas, the one who came home drunk and angry, who blamed her for his failures, who looked at her sometimes with something close to hatred. That man she did not mourn, but his death had still shattered something inside her. Trust, maybe, or hope, or just the illusion that life would ever be anything but a struggle to survive. Kieran arrived at her cabin just after noon the next day, leading a pack horse loaded with furs. Julia had been hanging laundry on the line strung between two trees, and she wiped her damp hands on her apron as he dismounted. "Mrs. Emmett," he said, "Mr. Nolan." She walked over to examine the hides, running her hands over the thick fur. "These are good quality, elk mostly, and a few deer." "Yes, madam. Took them last winter and this spring. Been keeping them as best I could, but they need proper tanning before they are worth anything." Julia calculated quickly. "I can do it for $3 a hide. That is 12 hides, so $36 total. It will take me about 3 weeks if the weather holds. That is fair." He untied the bundle and set it near her woodpile. "I also brought this." He pulled a heavy wool coat from his saddlebag. "Needs the lining replaced and some buttons." Julia took the coat, noting the quality of the fabric beneath the dirt and wear. This had been an expensive garment once. "Where did you get this?" "It was my father's." The words came out flat, emotionless. "He died 6 years ago. I am sorry. Are you?" Kieran's eyes met hers, and there was no challenge in the question, only genuine curiosity. "I suppose it depends on whether he was a good man or not," Julia said carefully. "He was not." Kieran pulled out a leather pouch and counted coins into her hand. "Here is half up front for supplies you might need. I will pay the rest when the work is done." Julia looked down at the money in her palm, more than she had held at one time since Thomas died. "Thank you. I should thank you." Kieran started to turn away, then stopped. "Mrs. Emmett, can I ask you something, I suppose? You ever feel like you are already dead, and just nobody told your body yet?" The question was so unexpected, so perfectly articulated to describe the exact feeling that haunted her days, that Julia felt tears spring to her eyes again. She blinked them back furiously. "Every day," she whispered. "Every single day." Kieran nodded slowly. "Me too." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion. I will come back in 3 weeks to check on the work." Julia watched him ride away again, this strange mountain man who somehow understood the shape of her pain. She clutched the coins in her hand and felt something she had not felt in 8 months, a tiny spark of something that might, someday, become hope. The work was hard but satisfying. Julia had learned tanning from her grandmother back in Missouri, before she had married Thomas and moved west. She set up her tanning frame in the small barn behind her cabin and began the laborious process of scraping, soaking, and treating the hides. The physical labor left her exhausted at the end of each day, but it also left her too tired to lie awake thinking. She mended Kieran's coat in the evenings by lamplight, carefully replacing the torn silk lining with sturdy cotton fabric. As she sewed, she found herself wondering about him. What had driven him to live alone in the mountains? What had his father done to earn that flat, emotionless tone when Kieran spoke of him? And why did he look at her as though he recognized a fellow survivor? 2 weeks after his first visit, Kieran returned. Julia was bent over a hide, scraping away the last bits of membrane when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened, pressing a hand to her aching lower back, and saw him riding up the path. "Mr. Nolan," she called, "I was not expecting you for another week." He dismounted and walked over to examine her work, running his hands over the hides she had already finished. "These are excellent, better than I hoped. My grandmother was a perfectionist. She would box my ears if I did sloppy work, even now." Julia smiled at the memory, one of the few happy ones from her childhood. "I came to town early because I heard there might be an early snow coming," Kieran said. "Wanted to get ahead of it, but also—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his words again. "I wondered if you might need help with anything. Firewood, repairs, that sort of thing." Julia bristled instinctively. "I do not need charity, Mr. Nolan. Not charity, trade." He met her eyes steadily. "You are doing work for me. Seems only fair I do some work for you while I am here. Unless you have someone else who helps with the heavy tasks." She did not, and they both knew it. Julia had been dreading the approach of winter, knowing her woodpile was inadequate and she lacked the strength to chop enough to see her through the cold months. "I have a list," she admitted. "Things that need doing before winter, but I cannot afford to pay you." "Did I ask for payment?" Kieran tied his horse to the fence post. "Show me what needs doing." Over the next 3 hours, Julia watched in amazement as Kieran repaired the loose board on her cabin, replaced 2 cracked window panes, and then began splitting wood with steady, powerful strokes of her axe. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to hard labor, never complaining or stopping to rest. Julia brought him a cup of water and some bread and cheese for lunch. He accepted it with a nod of thanks and sat on her porch steps to eat, his eyes scanning the mountains in the distance. "Do you miss being around people?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Kieran chewed thoughtfully before answering. "No, people are complicated, mountains are not. That is a lonely way to live." "Lonely is not the same as alone," he looked at her. "I expect you know that." Julia sat down on the steps beside him, maintaining a proper distance. "I feel lonelier here in town, surrounded by people who think they know my story, than I ever did when Thomas was away on his schemes." "What is your story, Mrs. Emmett, if you do not mind me asking?" She did mind, had minded every time someone in town asked with false sympathy and real curiosity. But somehow, with Kieran, it felt different, like he was asking not to gather gossip but to understand. "I married young to a man who turned out to be someone different than I thought. He died in a stupid, preventable way and left me with nothing. Now I am the object of pity and speculation, the poor widow woman who might be desperate enough to accept any offer that comes her way." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "Are you? Desperate enough, I mean." "No." The word came out fierce. "I would rather starve than marry again out of necessity." "Good." Kieran finished his bread and stood. "Never let anyone make you smaller than you are just to make themselves feel bigger." He went back to chopping wood, and Julia sat there watching him, wondering who had tried to make him smaller. Wondering if that was why he lived in the mountains, away from people who might hurt him again. By the time the sun was setting, Julia had more firewood than she had dared hope for, neatly stacked against the side of her cabin. Kieran's shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool air, and there was a contentment in his face that had not been there that morning. "Thank you," Julia said. "I truly do not know how I would have managed without your help. You would have found a way. You seem like someone who always finds a way." He untied his horse. "I will camp up in the foothills tonight and come back tomorrow to see if there is anything else needs doing." "You do not have to do that. I know." He swung into the saddle. "But I want to." He rode off before she could respond, leaving Julia standing in her yard with her heart beating too fast and her thoughts in turmoil. She told herself it was just gratitude she felt, appreciation for his help. But deep down, she knew it was something more, something that frightened her with its intensity. Kieran returned the next morning with a freshly killed deer slung over his pack horse. "Figured you could use the meat," he said, lifting it down as though it weighed nothing. Julia wanted to protest, to insist she could not accept such a gift. But winter was coming and she was hungry, had been hungry for weeks, rationing her food to make it last. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will butcher it and we can share the meat." "It is too much for one person." They spent the day working side by side. Kieran helped her butcher the deer, showing her how to get the most meat from the carcass with minimal waste. Julia started a fire and began cooking some of the fresh meat, the smell making her mouth water. As they worked, they talked. Small things at first, safe topics like the weather and the state of the trails. But gradually the conversation deepened. "Why did you come west?" Kieran asked, washing blood from his hands in the creek. "Thomas wanted to make his fortune." "He heard about the silver strikes and thought he would get rich." Julia laughed without humor. "He was wrong about that, like he was wrong about most things. You did not want to come." "I wanted to be a good wife, to support my husband's dreams." She stirred the pot of meat, watching the fat sizzle. "I was a fool. You were young. Young people believe things will work out. What about you? Were you always a mountain man?" Kieran was quiet for so long that Julia thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I was raised on a ranch in Colorado. My father was a hard man, believed in discipline and obedience above all else. When I was 20, I told him I would not hit a horse the way he did, that there were better ways to train them. He told me if I would not follow his rules, I could leave. So you left." "So I left." Kieran dried his hands on his pants. "Spent a few years working different ranches, cowboying, learning to survive on my own. Then I came here, built my cabin, and decided I preferred the company of elk to the company of men. Do you ever see your family? My father is dead. My mother died when I was 12. I have a brother somewhere, but we have not spoken since I left." He looked at her. "I am broken too, Mrs. Emmett, just in different ways than you." "Julia," she said impulsively. "You can call me Julia." Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure maybe, or surprise. "Kieran," he replied. They ate dinner together on her porch as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. The meat was tender and flavorful, and Julia ate until she was actually full for the first time in weeks. Kieran ate with the steady focus of a man accustomed to meals being fuel rather than pleasure. "Can I ask you something?" Julia said as she collected their plates. "Yes." "When you first saw me in the general store, you looked at me like you knew me." "Why?" Kieran leaned back against the porch post, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I saw myself, someone going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Someone who woke up every morning wondering why they bothered. He paused. It is a hard way to exist. Yes, Julia whispered. It is. But maybe, Kieran said softly, maybe we do not have to exist that way forever. Maybe broken things can heal if they have help. Julia looked at him, at this strange, damaged man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. I do not know if I remember how to heal. Neither do I. Kieran stood and moved to stand in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But maybe we could learn together. Her breath caught. This was dangerous territory, the kind that could lead to more pain. She had sworn she would never let herself be vulnerable again, never let anyone close enough to hurt her. But when Kieran reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch so tender it made her eyes sting with tears, she could not find the strength to pull away. I should go, he said, though he made no move to leave. I do not want to, but I should. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. Because you deserve better than a man who has spent 6 years hiding from the world. Because I have nothing to offer you except a cabin in the mountains and a life of solitude. Because I am half convinced I do not know how to be around people anymore. He cupped her face in his rough hand. But mostly because if I stay, I am going to kiss you, and I do not think you are ready for that. Julia's heart was racing so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She should agree with him, should send him away and protect what was left of her shattered heart. But instead she heard herself say, "What if I am ready?" Kieran's eyes searched hers for a long moment. Then, moving slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle, achingly so, as though he thought she might break. His lips were warm and tasted like wood smoke and the wild spaces between mountains. Julia's hands came up to clutch his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted around her. When he pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I am scared, he said, his voice raw. I have not let myself feel anything in so long, and now I look at you and I feel everything. I am scared too, Julia admitted, but I am also tired of being alone inside my own skin. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Julia felt something crack open inside her chest. All the grief and pain and loneliness she had been holding back came flooding out, but instead of drowning her, it washed through her and left space for something new. Something fragile and tentative but real. They stood on her porch as darkness fell, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Julia felt like she might actually want to be alive. Kieran did not go back to his cabin that night. They sat up talking until the early hours of the morning, sharing stories and secrets they had never told anyone else. Julia told him about her difficult childhood with a father who drank too much and a mother who died too young. Kieran told her about the beatings his father had given him, the scars that still marked his back, the way he had learned to make himself small and quiet to avoid attention. I swore I would never be like him, Kieran said, as the first light of dawn began to color the sky. That is why I left. I was starting to feel angry all the time, and I was afraid of what I might become. You are nothing like that, Julia said fiercely. You are gentle and kind and good. How can you know that? You barely know me. I know enough. She took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work. I know you help people without expecting anything in return. I know you work hard and you are honest. I know the way you look at me makes me feel seen for the first time in my life. Kieran brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. You make me want to try again. to be around people, to have a life that is more than just survival. What kind of life do you want? He looked at her with such intensity that it took her breath away. One with you in it. It was too soon, too fast. They had known each other less than 3 weeks. But Julia found she did not care about propriety or appropriate waiting periods. She had spent 8 months being numb, and now she felt alive again, and she was not going to waste another moment denying what she wanted. Then stay, she said. Not forever, not yet, but stay a while longer. Help me finish the hides. Let us see what this could be. Kieran stayed. Over the next week they fell into an easy routine. He slept in her small barn, refusing to compromise her reputation by staying in the house, though he took every meal with her. During the day, they worked together on the hides and various other tasks around her property. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, learning each other's stories and silences. Julia found herself laughing again, something she had not done in so long she had almost forgotten the feeling. Kieran had a dry sense of humor that snuck up on her, and he delighted in making her smile. But there were hard moments, too. Times when she would see something that reminded her of Thomas and feel guilt crash over her for being happy when he was dead. Times when Kieran would grow quiet and withdrawn, lost in whatever dark memories haunted him. One evening, Julia woke to find Kieran sitting on her porch steps, staring out at the darkness. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him. "Cannot sleep?" she asked. "Nightmares," he said shortly. Julia waited, giving him space to say more if he wanted. After a long silence, he spoke again. "I dream about my father sometimes. In the dreams, I am still a boy, and he is coming at me with his belt, and I cannot move. I just stand there and take it." His voice was hollow. "I hate that I still dream about him, hate that he still has that power over me. Trauma does not just disappear because we want it to," Julia said softly. "It lives in our bodies, in our minds. It takes time to heal." "How long?" The question was almost desperate. "How long until I stop being afraid of a dead man? I do not know, but maybe you do not have to figure it out alone." She took his hand. "Maybe that is what healing looks like. Not doing it by yourself in the mountains, but letting someone walk beside you through it." Kieran looked at her, and in the moonlight she could see the moisture in his eyes. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said. "You know that. I do not feel strong. I feel like I am barely holding myself together most days. That is what strength is. Holding yourself together when everything inside you wants to fall apart." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "We are quite a pair, are we not? Two broken people trying to figure out how to be whole." "Maybe we do not need to be whole," Julia said. "Maybe we just need to be honest about our cracks." They sat together until the sky began to lighten, drawing comfort from each other's presence. And when Kieran finally went back to the barn to sleep for a few hours, Julia felt something settle in her chest. A sense of rightness she had never experienced before. The 3 weeks Kieran had initially promised to return and stretched to 4, then 5. The hides were long finished, beautiful and supple, worth far more than he had paid her. His coat was mended and hanging in her cabin. But neither of them mentioned him leaving. The town had begun to notice. Julia could feel the stares when she went to the general store, hear the whispers that stopped when she approached. She knew what they were saying. That the widow Emmett had taken up with that strange mountain man, that she had no shame, that it was improper. She found she did not care. Let them whisper. She had spent too long caring what other people thought, trying to be the perfect wife to a man who had not deserved her effort. For the first time in her life, she was choosing what she wanted instead of what was expected. But the gossip bothered Kieran. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders when they walked through town together, the way his jaw clenched when someone stared too long. "I am ruining your reputation," he said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. "My reputation was already ruined when my husband died cheating at cards," Julia replied calmly. "At least now I am being scandalous for something I actually chose. Julia, I am serious. If people think we are living in sin, they will not hire you for work. They will freeze you out. Then I will leave. Go somewhere else where no one knows my history. You should not have to leave your home because of me." Julia set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him steadily. "This place stopped being my home the day Thomas died. It is just a place I have been surviving in. Home is where you feel safe, where you feel like yourself. And I have felt more at home sitting on my porch with you these past weeks than I have in the entire time I lived here." Kieran crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that if you ask me to come with you to your cabin in the mountains, I will say yes. I am saying that I do not care what the town thinks, or what is proper, or what the appropriate mourning period is. I am saying that I am falling in love with you, Kieran Nolan, and I do not want to waste another day of my life pretending otherwise." He stared at her, something fierce and tender blazing in his eyes. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I started loving you the first moment I saw you in that store, looking like you were one more blow away from shattering but still standing tall. You are the bravest, most beautiful person I have ever known, and I do not deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to." Julia slid off the chair and into his arms, kissing him with all the love and hope and desperate need she had been holding back. They had been careful before, keeping their kisses chaste, always conscious of propriety. But now, with their feelings spoken aloud, something broke free. Kieran kissed her like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and Julia arched against him, wanting to crawl inside his skin and lie there where nothing could hurt them. "Come with me," he said between kisses. "Come to the mountains. Let me build you a life where you can be free and wild and yourself." "Yes," Julia breathed. "Yes to all of it." They were married a week later by a traveling preacher passing through Taylorsville. It was a simple ceremony, witnessed only by the shopkeeper and his wife, who seemed to think the whole thing was wildly romantic despite their earlier disapproval. Julia wore her best dress, which was still faded and patched, and Kieran wore his father's coat, now beautifully mended with its new lining. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed her with such tenderness that Julia felt tears slip down her cheeks. Happy tears this time, the first happy tears she had cried in longer than she could remember. They spent their wedding night in her cabin, and Kieran was patient and gentle, making sure she felt safe and cherished. After, as they lay tangled together in her narrow bed, Julia traced the scars on his back and cried for the boy he had been, the one who had suffered so much. Kieran held her and let her cry, understanding that she was weeping not just for him but for herself, for both of them and all the pain they had endured to get to this moment. "We are going to be all right," he whispered into her hair. "I promise you, Julia. We are going to build something good together." "I believe you," she said, and meant it. They left Taylorsville 3 days later, Julia's few possessions packed onto Kieran's horses. She looked back once at the cabin where she had been so unhappy, then turned her face toward the mountains and did not look back again. The journey to Kieran's cabin took most of a day. They climbed higher into the foothills, following trails that were barely visible, until they reached a small valley tucked between two peaks. A creek ran through it, and aspens grew thick along the banks. The cabin sat in a clearing, small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. "You built this yourself?" Julia asked, sliding down from her horse. "Took me 2 years, working on it between hunting and trapping. It is not much, but it is sturdy, keeps the weather out. Kieran looked almost nervous. I know it is not what you are used to. Julia looked at the cabin, at the mountains rising around them, at the creek singing over its rocky bed, and felt something ease in her chest. Peace, she realized. This was what peace felt like. It is perfect, she said. Absolutely perfect. The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a loft for sleeping, but it was clean and well made. Kieran had clearly prepared for her arrival, adding feminine touches that made her throat tight with emotion. A vase for flowers on the table, curtains on the windows, a rocking chair by the fire. I wanted you to feel welcome, he said, watching her take it all in. Wanted you to know this is your home now, not just mine. Julia turned and kissed him. Anywhere with you is home. They settled into mountain life with surprising ease. Julia had grown up doing hard physical work, and she took to the rhythms of their days naturally. She learned to help Kieran with his trap lines, to read the weather in the clouds that gathered around the peaks, to identify animal tracks in the snow. Winter came early that year, a heavy snowfall in late October that buried the valley under 2 feet of white. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, but Julia found she did not mind. The world outside their cabin ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, the fire, the endless quiet of snow falling. It was during those long winter months that they truly learned each other. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. They shared silence too, comfortable enough with each other that they did not always need words. Kieran taught her to shoot, setting up targets and patiently correcting her stance until she could hit them consistently. Julia taught him to read better, having discovered that his schooling had been sporadic at best. They read together by firelight, Julia's head resting on his shoulder, her finger following the words on the page. They made love often, learning each other's bodies with patience and curiosity. Julia discovered that Kieran was as gentle and attentive in bed as he was in everything else, always making sure she felt pleasure before seeking his own. And slowly, tentatively, they both began to heal. There were still hard days. Days when Julia would be overwhelmed by grief or guilt, when the weight of everything she had lost would crush down on her. Kieran would hold her through it, let her cry, never trying to fix it or make it better, just being there. And there were days when Kieran's nightmares were so bad he could barely function, when he would retreat into himself, and Julia could see the scared boy he had been. She learned to give him space when he needed it, to be steady and present without pushing, to remind him through her actions that he was safe now. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Coming here with me, giving up your life in town?" Julia looked at him, at the firelight dancing across his face, at the love and vulnerability in his eyes. "Not for a single moment. Do you regret asking me?" "God, no." He pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "You saved my life, Julia. I know that sounds dramatic, but it is true. I was barely existing before you. Now I am actually living. You saved mine too," she said softly. "We saved each other." Spring came eventually, the snow melting to reveal green grass and wildflowers. Julia discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy on Kieran's face when she told him made her cry. "Are you happy?" he asked, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," she said honestly. The pregnancy was not easy. Julia was sick for months, and the isolation of the mountains meant she had no other women to ask for advice. But Kieran was devoted, taking over all the heavy work, making sure she ate and rested, reading to her when she was too tired to move. As her belly grew, Julia sometimes felt afraid. She had seen women die in childbirth, knew the risks, but Kieran's steady presence calmed her fears. "You are the strongest person I know," he told her over and over. "You can do this." They made the journey down to Taylorsville in late October, before the heavy snows came, so Julia could be near the midwife when her time came. They stayed in a small room above the general store, and Julia was touched when several of the women from town came to visit, bringing baby clothes and advice. Their son was born on a cold November morning in 1873. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Julia thought she might not survive it. But Kieran stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth, telling her she could do this. She was almost there. He loved her so much. When the baby finally emerged, screaming and red-faced and perfect, Julia wept with relief and joy. Kieran held their son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, looking at the tiny life they had created with such wonder that Julia fell in love with him all over again. "What should we name him?" she asked weakly, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "What about Samuel?" Kieran said. "It was my grandfather's name. He was the only person in my family who was ever kind to me." "Samuel Nolan," Julia tested the name. "I love it." They stayed in town for a month until Julia was strong enough to travel, then returned to their mountain home with their precious cargo. Winter closed in around them, but this time they were not alone. They had Samuel, this tiny life that depended on them, that had been created from their love. Being parents was harder than either of them had anticipated. Samuel was colicky, crying for hours at a time, and Julia was often overwhelmed with exhaustion. But Kieran was an involved father in a way that surprised her. He walked Samuel when he cried, changed his diapers without complaint, sang to him in a surprisingly good voice. "My father never touched us except to discipline us," Kieran said one night as he rocked Samuel to sleep. "I swore my son would know every day that he was loved and wanted." Julia watched her husband with their son and felt her heart expand until it ached. This was what she had always wanted without knowing it. A family built on love and respect, not obligation. A partner who was truly a partner, sharing both the joys and the burdens. The years passed peacefully. Samuel grew into a bright, curious child who loved following his father around and helping with chores. Julia discovered she was pregnant again when Samuel was 3, and their daughter arrived the following spring. They named her Rose after Julia's grandmother. Life in the mountains was not easy. There were lean winters when game was scarce, hot summers when the creek ran low, illnesses and accidents that frightened them. But they faced it all together, and somehow that made even the hardest times bearable. Kieran continued his hunting and trapping, but he also began raising horses, using the gentle methods he had defended to his father all those years ago. Word spread about the quality of his animals, and people began making the journey to their valley specifically to buy from him. The extra income meant they could make improvements to the cabin, adding on rooms as their family grew. Julia took in some sewing work again, not because she needed the money, but because she enjoyed it. She became known for the beautiful quilts she made, each one a unique work of art. She taught both Samuel and Rose to sew, believing that all children should know how to care for themselves regardless of their gender. They went to Taylorsville several times a year for supplies and to attend church services. Julia reconnected with a few of the women from town, and while they were never close friends, there was a mutual respect. People had stopped gossiping about the widow and her mountain man once they saw how devoted Kieran and Julia were to each other, how well they had built their life together. On their 5th anniversary, Kieran surprised Julia by taking her to a spot high in the mountains, a meadow filled with wildflowers that overlooked the entire valley. They had a picnic while Samuel and Rose played nearby, and as the sun set, Kieran pulled out a small box. Inside was a gold ring, simple but beautiful, with a small diamond that caught the light. "I know we have been married 5 years already," Kieran said, suddenly nervous. "But when we got married, I did not have money for a proper ring. I have been saving, and I wanted you to have this. Wanted you to have something beautiful like you." Julia's eyes filled with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "You did not have to do this. I wanted to. You deserve beautiful things, Julia. You deserve everything." He cupped her face in his hands. "These 5 years with you have been the happiest of my life. You took a broken man who was barely surviving and taught him how to live again. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. You did the same for me," Julia said, kissing him softly. "I was so lost, so convinced I would never be happy again. And then you walked into that general store and saw me, really saw me, and everything changed." They held each other as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their children playing nearby, their love as strong as the mountains surrounding them. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and small moments that added up to a life. Samuel grew tall and strong, with his father's quiet nature and his mother's determination. Rose was spirited and creative, always drawing or making up stories. They had one more child, a daughter they named Grace, born when Julia was 35. Kieran's brother, Daniel, found them when Samuel was 10. He had heard about the mountain man who raised exceptional horses and came to investigate. The reunion was awkward at first, years of silence and hurt between them. But Daniel had changed too, had his own family now, and he understood why Kieran had left in a way he had not when they were younger. The two brothers began to rebuild their relationship slowly, exchanging letters and occasional visits. It healed something in Kieran that Julia had not even realized was still wounded, and she was grateful to see him reconnect with his past on his own terms. Life was not perfect. There were arguments and difficult times, moments when the stress of raising 3 children in the mountains felt overwhelming. But Julia and Kieran had learned to face challenges together, to communicate even when it was hard, to remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. On their 20th anniversary, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children were grown now, or nearly so. Samuel was 18 and talking about starting his own ranch. Rose was 15 and wanted to be a teacher. Grace was 10 and undecided about everything except that she loved horses as much as her father did. "Can you believe it has been 20 years?" Julia asked, leaning against Kieran's shoulder. "Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like you have always been here, like I cannot remember what my life was like before you." He kissed the top of her head. "I was thinking about that day in the general store. What would have happened if I had not spoken to you? I do not know. I suppose I would have continued surviving. Maybe eventually I would have remarried out of necessity. Maybe I would have left town and started over somewhere else." Julia laced her fingers through his. "But I cannot imagine any of those lives being as good as this one. You ever miss it? Town life, having neighbors close by, the conveniences." Julia thought about it honestly. There were things she missed sometimes. The ease of buying what she needed instead of making it, having other women to talk to regularly, the sense of being part of a community. But those were small things compared to what she had gained. "No," she said finally. "I do not miss it. This is where I belong, here with you with our children in these mountains. You asked me once if I felt like I was already dead. Do you remember?" "I remember." "I do not feel that way anymore. I feel alive, Kieran. More alive than I ever did before. You did that. You healed me." "We healed each other," Kieran corrected gently. "I was broken inside when I met you. angry and scared and convinced I was better off alone, but you saw past all of that. You said let me heal beside you, and you did. You stood next to me while I figured out how to be whole again. And you stood next to me, Julia said, turning to look at him. At 44, he was graying at the temples, his face more lined than when they had met. But his eyes still held that same intensity, that same deep love that had captivated her from the beginning. We are not broken anymore, are we? No, Kieran agreed. We are not broken. We are healed and we are whole and we are together. That is all that matters. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside, they could hear their children laughing about something, the sound of home and family and love. Julia thought back to that woman she had been 20 years ago, counting her coins in the general store with desperation and grief weighing her down. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, would she believe it? That the mountain man with the sad eyes would become her whole world, that they would build a life filled with more joy than sorrow, that she would be truly, deeply happy? Probably not. That woman had been too broken to imagine healing. But then Kieran had offered her his hand and said, let me heal beside you, and everything had changed. What are you thinking about? Kieran asked, always attuned to her moods. About how lucky I am. About how close I came to missing all of this. She squeezed his hand. About how grateful I am that you saw me that day. I will always see you, Julia, Kieran said seriously. For the rest of my life, however long that may be, I will see you, and I will love you, and I will be grateful for every single day we have together. Julia leaned up and kissed him, pouring 20 years of love and gratitude and devotion into it. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Come on, Julia said, standing and pulling him to his feet. Let us go inside. Our children made dinner tonight, and I want to see what disaster awaits us in the kitchen. They walked inside hand in hand, into the warm light and laughter of their home. And as Julia looked around at her family, at the life they had built together in these mountains, she felt nothing but profound contentment. She had been broken once, shattered by loss and disappointment, and the cruelty of a world that took more than it gave. But Kieran had been broken too, and together they had learned that broken things could be mended. That healing was possible if you had someone to stand beside you through the pain. That love, real love, was not about being perfect, but about accepting each other's imperfections and choosing each other anyway. The years continued to flow like water, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. Samuel did start his own ranch, settling in a valley about 20 miles from their own. He married a sweet-natured woman named Catherine, and they had 4 children who called Kieran and Julia Grandma and Grandpa, and brought chaos and joy when they visited. Rose became a teacher as she had dreamed, moving to a growing town about 50 miles away. She married a kind man who supported her passion for education, and together they opened a school that welcomed all children, regardless of their ability to pay. Julia was fiercely proud of her daughter's independence and compassion. Grace, their youngest, stayed closest to home. She inherited Kieran's gift with horses and eventually took over that part of the business entirely. She married a cowboy who had come to buy horses and stayed for the daughter, and they built their own cabin just across the creek from Kieran and Julia's. As grandchildren multiplied and years passed, Kieran and Julia settled into the comfortable rhythm of older age. They moved more slowly now, their bodies bearing the accumulated aches and pains of lives spent in hard physical work. But they were still strong, still active, still very much in love. On quiet evenings they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, holding hands and sometimes not speaking at all. They did not need words anymore to communicate. A look, a touch, The simple presence of the other was enough. Kieran's nightmares had mostly faded over the years, appearing only occasionally now. When they did, Julia was always there, a steady presence in the darkness, reminding him that he was safe and loved. And when Julia had moments of grief or sadness, remnants of her first marriage and all that pain, Kieran held her and let her feel what she needed to feel without judgment. They had learned, over their decades together, that healing was not a destination but a journey. There would always be scars, always be moments when the past rose up to haunt them. But they had also learned that those scars did not define them, that the past did not have to dictate the future. On their 30th anniversary, their entire family gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. The house was bursting with children and grandchildren, with laughter and noise and love. Julia cooked for days preparing the feast, and Kieran made sure there was enough wood stock to keep everyone warm during their visit. As the sun set on that perfect day, with their family surrounding them and the mountain standing eternal watch, Samuel stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us that family is not about blood or obligation, but about love and choice. Who showed us that broken people can heal if they have the courage to try. Who built a life in these mountains that was richer than any amount of silver or gold could provide." He raised his glass. "Thank you for everything you have given us. Thank you for showing us what love looks like." Everyone raised their glasses, calling out agreement and love. Julia looked at Kieran and saw tears streaming down his face. She squeezed his hand, her own eyes wet. "Can you believe this is our life?" he whispered to her. "Can you believe we created all of this?" "Yes," Julia said simply. "Because I know what we survived to get here. I know how hard we fought, how much we sacrificed, how many times we chose each other and chose love even when it would have been easier to give up." She looked around at their assembled family. "This is what we built from our broken pieces. Something beautiful and strong and lasting." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Julia and Kieran walked out to their spot in the meadow, the same place where he had given her the ring all those years ago. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any town lights, stretching from horizon to horizon in an endless river of light. "I want to tell you something," Kieran said, pulling Julia close against the cold. "Something I have never been able to put into words properly." "What is it?" "That day in the general store, when I first saw you, I was not planning to speak to you. I had come to town for supplies like always, planning to get what I needed and leave. I had given up on people, on connection, on ever having anything more than the solitary life I had built." He paused, his voice catching. "But then I saw you, and something in me recognized something in you. I saw your pain and your strength, and I knew that if I walked away, I would regret it for the rest of my life." "I am so glad you did not walk away," Julia said. "What I am trying to say is that you saved my life. Not metaphorically, but literally. I was existing, not living. I was going through the motions day after day, waiting without knowing what I was waiting for. And then you appeared, and suddenly I had a reason to try again. A reason to believe that maybe I deserved more than loneliness and pain." Julia turned in his arms so she could see his face in the starlight. "You did the same for me. I was drowning, Kieran, slowly sinking under the weight of grief and disappointment and fear. And then you offered me your hand and said, 'Let me heal beside you. Not fix you, not save you, but heal beside you, as equals, as partners.' That is all I ever wanted to be," Kieran said. "Your partner in everything. And you have been. For 30 years, through everything life has thrown at us, you have been beside me. Not in front of me trying to protect me from life, not behind me pushing me forward, but beside me, walking the same path." They kissed under the stars, two people who had found each other in their darkest moments and chosen to build a life together. Two people who had been broken and had healed, not by erasing their scars, but by learning to carry them with grace. As they walked back to their cabin hand in hand, Julia felt nothing but profound gratitude. For this man who loved her, for the family they had built, for the life they had created in these mountains. For every moment of joy and sorrow, every challenge overcome, every day they had woken up and chosen each other again. The years after that passed more quickly, as years do when you are older and time becomes precious. Kieran developed arthritis in his hands, making some tasks difficult. Julia's eyesight began to fail, forcing her to give up her detailed quilting work. But they adapted, found new ways to be useful and productive, accepted the limitations of aging bodies with grace if not always enthusiasm. Their children were attentive and loving, visiting often and helping with tasks that had become too difficult. The grandchildren brought energy and chaos, reminding them of when their own children had been small. And slowly, imperceptibly, Kieran and Julia began the process of letting go, of passing the torch to the next generation. On a golden afternoon in their 42nd year of marriage, Kieran suffered a stroke while working in the horse barn. Grace found him and rode for the doctor immediately, but by the time help arrived, Kieran was already slipping away. Julia sat by his bedside, holding his hand as their entire family gathered around. His eyes found hers, and even though he could not speak, she knew what he was trying to say. "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too, more than I can ever say." His fingers squeezed hers weakly, and then he was gone. The great love of her life, the man who had healed beside her, the partner of her heart for more than 4 decades, had left her. The grief was crushing, absolute. Julia had known this day would come eventually, but knowing did not make it easier. She had lost Thomas and felt relief mixed with her guilt. But losing Kieran felt like losing part of herself, the best part, the part that had learned to be truly happy. Her children held her as she wept, and the entire mountain community came to pay their respects. Kieran had touched more lives than Julia had realized, his quiet kindness and integrity making an impression on everyone he met. They buried him in the meadow where he had proposed properly with the ring, where they had stood under the stars and promised to heal beside each other. Julia stood at his grave with their children and grandchildren surrounding her, and she spoke from her heart. "You were the best man I ever knew," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You stood beside me when I was broken and helped me become whole again. I will miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I will never regret a single moment we had together. You were my greatest blessing, and I was lucky beyond measure to be your wife." In the months after Kieran's death, Julia struggled. The cabin felt too empty, too quiet without his presence. She would turn to tell him something and remember he was not there. She would wake in the night reaching for him and find only empty space, but she did not fall apart. Kieran had taught her too well how to be strong, how to face hardship with courage. And she had their family, the legacy of their love, to keep her going. Grace and her husband invited Julia to move in with them, but she declined. This cabin held too many memories, too much of Kieran's presence. She could not leave it, not yet, maybe not ever. Instead, she settled into a new routine. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them to sew and garden and cook. She walked in the mountains Kieran had loved, feeling close to him in the spaces he had cherished. She sat on their porch in the evenings and talked to him, telling him about her day, about the children, about how much she missed him. And slowly, gradually, the sharp edge of grief began to dull. The pain did not disappear, would never disappear completely, but it became something she could carry. a weight she had learned to bear, just as she had learned to bear all the other weights life had handed her. Julia lived for another 8 years after Kieran's death. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with quiet contentment and the satisfaction of a life well lived. She never remarried, never even considered it. Kieran had been her great love, her partner, her soulmate. There would never be anyone else. On a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming in the meadow, Julia passed peacefully in her sleep. She was 76 years old, and she died in the cabin she and Kieran had shared, surrounded by the family they had created together. Her children buried her next to Kieran in the meadow, under a simple headstone that read, Julia Emmett Nolan, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She learned to heal and taught others to do the same. At the funeral, Samuel spoke about his parents with tears streaming down his weathered face. My father used to tell us that broken things could be mended if you had someone to stand beside you through the pain. My parents found each other when they were both broken, and together they built something beautiful. They showed us what love looks like, not the easy kind but the real kind. The kind that chooses the other person every day, that stands beside them through joy and sorrow, that never gives up even when things are hard. He looked out at the assembled family, at all the people whose lives had been shaped by Kieran and Julia's love. They are together now, wherever they are, healed and whole and together, and that is exactly as it should be. The family gathered in the cabin after the service, sharing stories and memories. They talked about Julia's fierce determination and kind heart, about Kieran's quiet strength and gentle nature. They remembered specific moments, Julia teaching them to sew, Kieran showing them how to track animals, the two of them dancing in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, it was easy to imagine two figures standing in the meadow, holding hands and watching over the family they had created. Two people who had been broken and had healed beside each other, whose love had been powerful enough to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Their story was not one of easy romance or perfect happiness. It was a story of two damaged people who found each other in their darkest moments and chose to heal together, who faced their traumas and their fears with honesty and courage, who built a life from broken pieces that was stronger and more beautiful than if they had never been broken at all. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson they left behind, that brokenness is not the end of the story. That healing is possible if you have the courage to be vulnerable, to let someone see your scars, to stand beside another broken person and say, "Let us heal together." Their love story lived on in the family they created, in the values they instilled, in the way their children and grandchildren approached their own relationships. When challenges came, as they always do, the family would remember Kieran and Julia. Remember how they faced hardship together, how they chose each other every day, how they proved that broken people can heal if they have someone to stand beside them. The mountain cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations. It was expanded and modernized over the years, but the heart of it remained the same. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, people swore they could feel the presence of the couple who had first built a life there. A sense of peace and deep, abiding love that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Because that was what Kieran and Julia had created together. Not just a family or a home, but a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. A testament to the power of choosing each other, of healing beside each other, of building something beautiful from broken pieces. They had been widow and mountain man, both broken inside, both convinced they would never be whole again. But they had found each other at exactly the right moment, And together they had learned that healing was not about erasing the past or pretending the pain did not exist. It was about accepting the brokenness and choosing to move forward anyway. About standing beside someone and saying, "I see your scars and I am not afraid. Let me show you mine." And in that vulnerable, courageous act of mutual healing, they had found not just love but redemption, not just partnership but purpose, not just survival but a life rich with meaning and joy. Their story was proof that it is never too late to heal, never too late to find love, never too late to build something beautiful. That the most powerful transformations often happen when two broken people choose to face their healing together, side by side, step by step, day by day. In the meadow where they were buried, wildflowers bloomed every spring without fail. The family liked to think that was Julia and Kieran's doing, their way of reminding everyone who came there that from brokenness comes beauty, from pain comes growth, from darkness comes light. And on quiet nights when the stars filled the mountain sky, it was easy to imagine them there still, standing together in the meadow, holding hands, watching over the family they loved. Two souls who had found each other across the brokenness and chosen to heal beside each other, their love a beacon that would shine on through the generations, lighting the way for all who came after.